On April 14, 2024, at 11:34 in the morning, 12,467 feet below the North Atlantic surface, Garrett's ROV cameras captured something that should not exist. The thermal reading on his monitor showed 68 degrees Fahrenheit inside a sealed chamber of the Titanic wreckage. The surrounding ocean water measured 34 degrees. No power source had existed in that ship for 112 years, yet somehow, impossibly, this room was warm. Garrett stared at the numbers, rechecked the instruments, ran the diagnostic sequence twice. The readings held steady. His hands tightened on the controls of the submersible as his mind worked through the physics, the impossibility of what he was seeing. He had been diving the Titanic since 2009, 47 expeditions to this graveyard, and he knew every blueprint, every deck plan, every architectural drawing archived at the Smithsonian and the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic. This section, this chamber between cargo holds C and D, did not appear on any of them. He was 39 years old, father to an 8-year-old daughter named Maya, and he had spent 15 years of his life as a technical deep-sea ROV operator. He had consulted on James Cameron's documentary expedition in 2018, helped map the debris field for the National Geographic Survey in 2021, trained the next generation of submersible pilots at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. His certification was pristine, his reputation unquestioned. When wealthy collectors wanted something recovered from the Titanic, they called Garrett. This mission had started 3 weeks ago with a phone call from a private collector in Manhattan. The voice on the line was refined, educated, offering $200,000 for a specific job. Recover personal items from stateroom B-52, first-class accommodations on the port side. Diamond cufflinks, a gold pocket watch, a leather journal. The collector claimed these items belonged to his great-grandfather who had perished in the sinking. He had provided documentation, passenger manifests, even photographs of the objects. Everything checked out. The expedition launched from St. John's, Newfoundland, on April 11th with a crew of 6, operating from a support vessel called the Deep Explorer, using the Titan II submersible equipped with 8K cameras and a 6-axis robotic arm capable of precision retrieval work. But stateroom B-52 had been empty when Garrett's ROV arrived. Not picked clean by previous expeditions, not collapsed by ocean pressure. Empty as if it had never been occupied at all. The furniture was intact, the fixtures undisturbed, but there were no personal effects, no luggage, nothing. Garrett had expanded the search pattern, methodically scanning adjacent sections when the sonar picked up the anomaly. A void space between the cargo holds, 32 feet long by 18 feet wide, completely absent from the original ship schematics. He maneuvered the ROV closer, the LED array illuminating collapsed corridors and buckled steel. The Titanic at this depth was a tomb of rust and twisted metal, organic material long since consumed by extremophile bacteria that turned iron into brittle formations resembling icicles. But this door, when his cameras found it, was different. The steel showed no corrosion, no rust, no bacterial growth. It was pristine, as if it had been installed yesterday. And covering its surface, etched deep into the metal, were hieroglyphic symbols. Garrett had studied enough maritime history to recognize Egyptian hieroglyphs when he saw them, though he could not read them. What he could recognize was that they should not be here, carved into a door on a British passenger liner built in Belfast in 1911. The White Star Line did not decorate cargo hold access points with ancient Egyptian script. This was not original to the ship's construction. Someone had put this here, either before the Titanic sailed or, impossibly, after it sank. The door was sealed, but there was a gap near the bottom, perhaps 8 inches wide, where the steel had buckled slightly under the immense pressure. Garrett guided the ROV's camera to the opening, adjusted the angle, and switched on the additional lighting. The video feed showed him what was inside, and his breath caught in his throat. The chamber beyond was not flooded. It was a dry space, an air pocket preserved for over a century at the bottom of the ocean, and the temperature sensor, thrust through the gap, confirmed what his instruments had been telling him. 68 degrees Fahrenheit. He could see objects inside, stone surfaces, angular shapes, the unmistakable form of carved granite. And in the center of the visible space, resting on what appeared to be a pedestal, a small object made of gold caught the light and reflected it back with an intensity that should not have been possible in the weak LED glow. Garrett reached for the radio to contact the surface team, then stopped. Something made him hesitate, some instinct born from 15 years of navigating the politics of deep-sea salvage and the territorial nature of maritime archaeology. He thought about the empty stateroom, the collector who had sent him here, the $200,000 payment that now felt less like a recovery fee and more like a test. Had someone known this chamber existed? Had they sent him here specifically to find it? He made his decision. He would enter the room first, document what was inside, and then report. The ROV was narrow enough to fit through the gap. He adjusted the thrusters, angled the nose down, and carefully, inch by inch, maneuvered the submersible through the opening in the door. The camera crossed the threshold, and Garrett saw the full interior for the first time. 3 sarcophagi made of black granite stood against the far wall, each one sealed, each one covered in the same strange hieroglyphic script. The room was completely dry, the air visible as a shimmer on the thermal camera. And impossible as it was, the objects inside looked as fresh and preserved as the day they had been placed there. The ROV's dimensions were carefully calculated, 22 inches wide by 31 inches long, designed to navigate tight spaces in shipwrecks, where human divers could never venture. Garrett worked the controls with practiced precision, feeling the resistance as the submersible's frame scraped against the buckled steel of the doorway, metal grinding against metal in a sound his hydrophones picked up and transmitted to his headset as a low, grating vibration. The camera feed showed the gap widening slightly as the ROV pushed through, and then suddenly it was inside, fully clear of the entrance, suspended in this impossible pocket of preserved air 12,000 feet below the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. The dimensions of the chamber became clear as Garrett panned the cameras in a slow 360 sweep. 32 feet long, 18 feet wide, ceiling height approximately 9 feet based on the reference measurements his laser mapping system provided. The walls were lined with the same uncorroded steel as the door, and covering every surface were hieroglyphic inscriptions, dense columns of symbols that ran from floor to ceiling in precise, orderly rows. But these were not the hieroglyphs he had seen in museums or documentaries about ancient Egypt. The symbols were similar, recognizable as the same writing system, but the specific characters, the combinations, the way they were arranged, all of it felt wrong, unfamiliar, like a dialect of a language he had only ever heard spoken properly. The 3 sarcophagi dominated the space, positioned against the far wall in perfect alignment. Each one measured approximately 7 feet in length, carved from black granite that appeared to be polished to a mirror finish, despite having spent over a century in this sealed chamber. The stone was flawless, no cracks, no weathering, no indication of age. Garrett zoomed the camera in on the nearest sarcophagus and saw that its surface was covered in more inscriptions, but these were different from the wall text. These symbols were carved deeper, more deliberately, and arranged in circular patterns that radiated out from a central point on the lid. His archaeological training was limited, but he knew enough to recognize that circular inscription patterns were associated with protective spells, binding rituals, warnings against disturbance. He switched to the thermal camera and watched the display light up with color. The ambient temperature in the room was 68 degrees Fahrenheit, but the sarcophagi themselves registered at 84 degrees. They were warmer than the surrounding air. They were generating heat. Garrett checked the sensor calibration, ran the diagnostic again, confirmed the reading. Stone does not generate heat. Stone does not maintain temperature. Stone certainly does not produce sustained warmth after 112 years submerged in near-freezing ocean water. Yet, his instruments insisted that this black granite was radiating thermal energy at a steady, consistent rate. The oxygen sensor mounted on the ROV's forward array provided the next impossibility. The air inside this chamber was not just present, it was breathable. 20.9% oxygen, 78.1% nitrogen, 0.9% argon, with trace amounts of carbon dioxide and other gases. Standard atmospheric composition at sea level pressure. Garrett stared at the numbers, trying to process what they meant. This room had been sealed since 1912 at the latest, possibly earlier. Any air trapped inside should have become depleted, stagnant, toxic. Organic decomposition, oxidation of materials, the slow chemical processes that occurred even in sealed environments, all of it should have altered the gas composition dramatically over 11 decades. But this air was fresh, as if it had been replaced yesterday, as if something inside the chamber was actively maintaining it. The pedestal stood in the exact center of the room, positioned equidistant from all four walls. It was carved from the same black granite as the sarcophagi, rising 3 feet from the floor in a tapered column that flared out at the top to form a shallow dish. And resting in that dish was the object Garrett had glimpsed from outside. A gold amulet, small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, shaped like an elongated oval with a loop at the top for a chain. But as the ROV's lights illuminated it directly, Garrett realized the gold was not simply reflecting the LED array. It was emitting its own light, a soft golden glow that pulsed with a rhythm that reminded him unsettlingly of a heartbeat. He guided the ROV closer, extending the robotic arm toward the pedestal. The manipulator had 6 degrees of freedom, capable of movements as delicate as threading a needle or as strong as cutting through steel cable. Garrett positioned the gripper fingers above the amulet, lowered them slowly, adjusted for the slight drift caused by the ROV's thrusters, compensating for its own neutral buoyancy. The metal fingers made contact with the gold surface. Every system failed simultaneously. The camera feeds cut to black. The thruster controls went dead. The robotic arm froze in position. Garrett's console lit up with error messages, cascading alerts that filled the screen faster than he could read them. Power fluctuation, communications loss, navigation system offline, depth sensor malfunction. The compass display spun wildly, the needle rotating through all 360 degrees in both directions as if magnetic north had ceased to exist. Emergency protocols activated automatically, initiating the ascent sequence, but the thrusters did not respond. The ROV was dead in the water, suspended in that impossible room with its mechanical hand wrapped around an object that should not exist. And then Garrett felt it. Inside the Titan II submersible, surrounded by titanium pressure hull and insulated life support systems, his body temperature dropped. It was not a gradual cooling, not the slow chill of malfunction in the environmental controls. It was instant and profound, as if someone had opened a freezer door directly onto his skin. His breath misted in front of his face, visible in the dim emergency lighting that had automatically engaged when the main power failed. The digital thermometer on his dive suit display read 89 degrees Fahrenheit. His normal body temperature was 98.6. He had lost nearly 10 degrees in less than 40 seconds. His vision doubled, the control panel splitting into overlapping images that refused to resolve no matter how hard he blinked. He tasted copper in his mouth, thick and metallic, and when he touched his upper lip, his gloved fingers came away dark with blood. His nose was bleeding, not the thin trickle of a broken capillary, but a steady flow that ran down over his mouth and chin. The submersible's medical sensors, still functioning on backup power, registered his vital signs with climbing alarm levels. Heart rate 132 beats per minute. Blood pressure 70/40. Core temperature continuing to drop. Garrett reached for the emergency ascent release, the manual override that would sever the ROV connection and rocket the Titan II toward the surface using compressed air bladders. His hand was shaking so badly he could barely grip the red lever. He pulled it with all the strength he could manage, heard the explosive hiss of pressurized gas, and felt the submersible lurch upward. The camera feeds remained black, but through the forward viewport he caught one last glimpse of the chamber as the Titan II rose past the doorway. The golden amulet was no longer on the pedestal. It was hovering in midair exactly where the ROV's gripper had touched it, suspended in the center of the room, glowing brighter now, pulsing faster, and in the audio feed from the ROV's external microphones, still transmitting despite all other systems being dead, Garrett heard voices. Whispers in a language he did not recognize. Multiple voices overlapping, rising and falling in rhythm with the pulsing light. The recording equipment captured 4 minutes and 17 seconds of audio before the feed finally cut to static. Later analysis would identify the language as no known dialect, no recorded tongue, no linguistic pattern that matched any database of ancient or modern speech. But in that moment, rising through 12,000 feet of ocean in a crippled submersible with his body temperature at 87 degrees and dropping, Garrett was not thinking about linguistic analysis. He was thinking about his daughter Maya, about her 8th birthday party scheduled for next weekend, about whether he would live to see the surface again. The ascent took 9 hours and 14 minutes. Standard decompression protocol for a dive to 12,467 feet required multiple safety stops to prevent nitrogen narcosis and decompression sickness. Automated sequences programmed into the Titan II's emergency systems that could not be overridden even in crisis. Garrett spent those 9 hours in a pressurized capsule the size of a compact car, watching his body temperature slowly climb from 87 degrees back toward normal, feeling the bleeding from his nose gradually stop, waiting for his vision to resolve from double images into single coherent views. The medical sensors monitored every vital sign, transmitting data to the surface team, and Garrett could hear the tension in the voices that periodically checked on him through the communication system. They knew something had gone wrong, but he told them only that there had been an equipment malfunction, that he would provide full details once he surfaced. He did not mention the chamber, the sarcophagi, the impossible warmth, the hovering amulet, or the voices that had whispered in his ears through the audio feed. When the Titan II finally broke the surface at 11:34 p.m., the deck lights of the Deep Explorer illuminated a scene that made Garrett's chest tighten with fresh unease. A medical team was assembled on the recovery platform, 4 people in full quarantine suits with portable isolation equipment, oxygen tanks, stretchers, and gear that looked more appropriate for containing a biological hazard than treating a diver with mild hypothermia. They had the submersible secured and the hatch open within 3 minutes, hands reaching in to help him out, voices calm and professional, but urgent. They checked his temperature immediately with 3 different instruments, 91.2 degrees, still abnormal, and they wrapped him in thermal blankets before guiding him into a sealed medical bay that had been set up in one of the cargo containers on the main deck. The doctor who examined him was thorough and silent, running blood tests, taking tissue samples, checking his neurological responses with a pen light, and a series of cognitive questions. Garrett asked how they had known to prepare quarantine equipment, how they had known he would need medical attention beyond standard post-dive examination. The doctor did not answer, just made notes on his tablet and told Garrett to rest, that someone would be along shortly to debrief him. Through the small window in the medical bay door, Garrett could see the deck activity, crew members moving with purpose, equipment being repositioned, and in the distance, approaching fast across the dark water, the running lights of another vessel. The ship arrived at 2:51 a.m., less than 3.5 hours after Garrett surfaced. He knew the travel time from Halifax to these coordinates, had made the journey himself 6 times over his career. 11 hours minimum in good weather with a fast vessel. This ship had covered the distance in 1/3 of that time, which meant it had departed Halifax before Garrett's submersible had even entered the forbidden chamber, before any emergency had been declared, before anyone on the surface could have known something was wrong. The vessel pulled alongside the Deep Explorer with practiced precision, and Garrett watched through his window as 2 men in dark suits crossed over on the transfer platform, accompanied by 4 crew members carrying equipment cases with NOAA logos stenciled on the sides. They came to the medical bay 20 minutes later. The older of the 2 men introduced himself as Commander Richards, Naval Intelligence, and his partner was Agent Torres from NOAA's Office of Marine Sanctuaries. They were polite, professional, and they already knew everything. They had photographs on a tablet, images of the chamber door with its hieroglyphic inscriptions, sonar scans showing the void space between cargo holds C and D, thermal readings indicating the temperature anomaly. The photographs were dated August 19, 1987. Garrett stared at the date stamp, his mind working through the implications. These images were 37 years old. The government had known about this chamber for nearly 4 decades, had documented it, studied it, and kept it classified. Commander Richards explained that Garrett's expedition was in violation of the Titanic Maritime Memorial Act of 1986, that the area was designated as a protected site, that unauthorized salvage operations carried significant legal penalties. The contract with the Manhattan Collector was void. The expedition charter was revoked, and all equipment, including the Titan II submersible, the ROV, cameras, data storage, and recording devices, would be confiscated for examination. The collector, when contacted, denied any knowledge of hiring Garrett, claimed no association with the expedition, and provided documentation showing he had been in Singapore for the past month. But Garrett had bank records on his phone showing wire transfers totaling $180,000, payment schedules, signed contracts with digital signatures that matched the collector's registered business credentials. Agent Torres asked specific questions about what Garrett had seen inside the chamber, and her phrasing made it clear she already knew the answers. She asked about the 3 sarcophagi, about the pedestal, about the amulet, about the thermal readings and the oxygen composition. She asked if he had touched anything, if he had experienced any physical symptoms, if he had heard anything unusual. Garrett answered truthfully, described the temperature drop, the nosebleed, the vision problems, the audio recording of whispers in an unknown language. Torres and Richards exchanged a glance, and Richards made a note on his tablet before looking back at Garrett with an expression that was almost sympathetic. "You're the fourth ROV operator to find that chamber," Richards said quietly, and something in his tone suggested he was breaking protocol by revealing even this small piece of information. The others were in 1985, 1996, and 2010. All of them experienced similar physical symptoms. All of them signed non-disclosure agreements. All of them were advised to discontinue deep-sea operations in the North Atlantic. Garrett felt ice forming in his stomach despite the thermal blankets. "What happened to them?" he asked, and Richard's expression shifted to something that might have been regret or warning or both. "That's classified," he said, then stood and gestured for Torres to follow him out. At the door, he paused and looked back at Garrett. "But I can tell you that none of them are currently working in maritime operations. Take that information however you like." Garrett signed the non-disclosure agreement 3 days later in a federal building in Boston, 43 pages of legal language that prohibited him from discussing the expedition, the chamber, or anything he had witnessed during the dive to the Titanic. The agreement came with financial compensation, $50,000 deposited into an account he was required to open specifically for this purpose, money that felt less like payment and more like hush money. He signed because he had no choice, because the alternative was federal prosecution and the possibility of losing custody of Maya, because Richards and Torres had made it clear that this was not a negotiation. But signing a piece of paper did not erase what he had seen, and it certainly did not stop him from asking questions. He started with the 3 other ROV operators Richards had mentioned: 1985, 1996, 2010. The first name was easy to find because it was famous in deep-sea exploration circles. Robert Ballard had discovered the Titanic wreck in September of 1985, leading an expedition funded jointly by the Navy and the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. But Ballard had a team, and buried in the crew manifests that Garrett found archived in maritime databases was a sonar technician named Donald Pierce, age 31 at the time, responsible for operating the side-scan sonar array that had first mapped the wreck site in detail. Pierce had left maritime work shortly after the expedition, moved to Texas, and according to public records had died in July of 2003. The death certificate listed cause as hypothermia in Texas in July, when the outside temperature had been 97 degrees Fahrenheit. The 1996 operator took more effort to identify, but Garrett had contacts in the international diving community, and he knew how to ask careful questions without revealing why he was asking. A Russian documentarian named Viktor Sokolov had led an independent expedition to the Titanic that year, filming for a project that was never completed. Sokolov had disappeared in 2008 during an unrelated expedition to Lake Baikal in Siberia, last seen diving to explore underwater thermal vents. His body was never recovered. The 2010 operator was harder still, but Garrett eventually traced her through Woods Hole internal newsletters. Dr. Sarah Chen, marine geologist, part of a research team studying sediment patterns around the wreck site. She was still alive, living in a private psychiatric facility in Massachusetts, diagnosed with what the medical records described as persistent delusional disorder, with specific focus on archaeological threat assessment. 3 people who had found the chamber. 3 people whose lives had been destroyed. Garrett thought about his own body temperature, which had stabilized at 93.4 degrees over the past week, still 4 degrees below normal, still unexplained by any medical examination. He thought about the strange dreams he was having, dreams of golden light and whispered voices and symbols that burned themselves into his vision even when he closed his eyes. He thought about the fact that he was already searching for answers despite the NDA, despite the consequences, because something in that chamber had touched him and he needed to understand what it was. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A maritime historian in London named Professor Malcolm Green had published a small academic paper in 1973 about unusual cargo manifests from the Titanic's maiden voyage. The paper had been largely ignored, buried in an obscure journal about transatlantic shipping history, but Green had noted several discrepancies in the official records. There were payments listed in White Star Line accounting ledgers that did not correspond to any documented passengers or cargo, significant sums that had been marked simply as special transport services, with no further detail. One entry in particular had caught Green's attention. 47,000 British pounds paid by the British Museum in January of 1912, 3 months before the Titanic's departure, for purposes listed only as discreet conveyance of sensitive collection. Garrett contacted Professor Green, now 91 years old and retired, living in a cottage in Cornwall. The old man remembered the paper, remembered the mystery of those payments, and he had continued researching the topic quietly over the decades, despite lack of academic interest. He had files, correspondence he had collected, documents he had obtained through Freedom of Information requests that had taken years to process. He sent Garrett digital scans of everything, hundreds of pages, and told him to be careful, that other people had asked about this material over the years, and some of them had stopped asking rather suddenly. The documents painted a picture that made horrifying sense. In November of 1911, a British archaeological team working in the Valley of Kings had discovered a tomb that was not on any official map, a burial site that had been deliberately concealed and whose existence had been erased from historical records. The tomb belonged to Akhenaten, the pharaoh who had tried to replace Egypt's traditional gods with worship of a single deity, the sun disk Aten. But this was not Akhenaten's main tomb, which had been found and documented decades earlier. This was something else, a secondary chamber that contained objects the pharaoh had hidden from his own priests, artifacts associated with what ancient texts called the ritual of eternal darkness. The British Museum had acquired these objects quietly, without public announcement, and had made arrangements to transport them to a private collector in New York, who had offered an enormous sum for the collection. But the artifacts could not be shipped through normal channels because their very existence contradicted established Egyptology, because their transportation had already resulted in deaths among the excavation team, because the Egyptian authorities would have seized them if they had known about the discovery. So the museum had approached White Star Line and paid £47,000, equivalent to over $6 million in modern currency, to have cargo hold section CD modified with special environmental controls, with sealed access, with thermal insulation that could maintain specific temperature conditions during the Atlantic crossing. The modifications were documented in shipyard records that Green had obtained from Belfast archives, work orders showing that the section between holds C and D had been reconstructed in March of 1912, just weeks before the Titanic's maiden voyage, with materials that included lead-lined steel plates and a sophisticated ventilation system that was far beyond anything needed for standard cargo storage. The work crew had consisted of 14 men, and the medical records from Belfast Royal Hospital showed that all 14 had sought treatment for unusual symptoms between January and April of 1912. High fever, nosebleeds, temperature dysregulation, vivid nightmares. 3 of them had died before the ship sailed. Cause of death listed as unexplained systemic failure. But what chilled Garrett to his core was the route analysis. The Titanic had been scheduled to take a northern path across the Atlantic. the standard shipping lane used by vessels traveling from Southampton to New York. The ship's planned route kept it south of known iceberg zones, following corridors that had been mapped and verified as safe for April travel. But according to testimony from surviving officers compiled in inquiry documents that Green had uncovered in British naval archives, Captain Edward Smith had received a coded telegram at 7:40 p.m. on April 14th, less than 4 hours before the collision. The message had come through Marconi Wireless from an unknown sender, and after reading it, Smith had ordered a course change, turning the Titanic southwest by approximately 12 degrees, taking the ship directly into a region where ice fields had been reported earlier that day by multiple other vessels. A surviving junior officer named Charles Lightoller had mentioned this in his private journal, entries that were never included in the official inquiry testimony. Lightoller wrote that Captain Smith had seemed distant and preoccupied after receiving the telegram, that he had gone to the bridge and made the course adjustment personally without explaining his reasoning to the other officers, and that when Lightoller had questioned the decision, Smith had replied only that certain cargo must not reach American shores. The Titanic struck the iceberg at 11:40 p.m. that night. The ship sank at 2:20 a.m. on April 15th. 1,500 people died, and cargo hold section CD, with its sealed chamber and its Egyptian artifacts and its impossible thermal regulation, went to the bottom of the Atlantic. The evidence suggested something that sounded insane, but fit every fact Garrett had gathered. The sinking had not been an accident. It had been a deliberate act, ordered by someone who knew what the Titanic was carrying, someone who believed those artifacts were dangerous enough that 1,500 deaths were an acceptable price to keep them from reaching their destination. And for 112 years, those objects had remained sealed in their chamber, preserved in conditions that defied physics, waiting in the darkness 12,000 feet below the surface, while governments monitored them and kept their existence classified, and ensured that anyone who found them would be silenced. Garrett lost his diving contracts within 6 weeks of returning from the Titanic expedition. The official explanation varied depending on who was asked, but the result was always the same. Insurance companies suddenly found technical violations in his certifications. Expedition companies discovered scheduling conflicts that made his services unnecessary. Research institutions politely declined his proposals with vague references to budget constraints. His reputation, built over 15 years of flawless operations, evaporated as if it had never existed. He moved with Maya to a small town in rural Oregon, bought a house with the $50,000 from the NDA settlement, and took a job teaching marine biology at a community college. His body temperature stabilized at 93 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 degrees below normal, a condition doctors called chronic idiopathic hypothermia, and admitted they could not explain or treat. The condition was not unique to him. Donald Pierce, the sonar technician from the 1985 expedition, had lived with the same temperature dysregulation for 18 years before his death. The autopsy report that Garrett obtained through a contact in the Texas Medical Examiner's office showed Pierce had died of hypothermia in his apartment in Austin on July 19, 2003, when the outside temperature was 97 degrees and his apartment's air conditioning had been turned off. His core body temperature at time of death was measured at 79 degrees Fahrenheit, a level incompatible with life, yet the autopsy found no underlying cause, no disease process, no explanation for why his body had simply stopped generating heat. Viktor Sokolov had disappeared in Lake Baikal in 2008, last seen diving to explore thermal vents in water that registered over 140 degrees Fahrenheit. His dive partner had reported that Viktor kept saying he was cold, that he needed to get warmer, and he had descended deeper into the vent system until the tether ran out, and he vanished into superheated water that should have killed him instantly. Dr. Sarah Chen was still alive in Massachusetts, still convinced that something from the Titanic chamber was coming for her, still warning anyone who would listen that the artifacts were waking up. And she might have been right. Garrett had maintained access to satellite oceanographic data through his academic position, and he monitored the coordinates of the Titanic wreck with the obsessive focus of someone who knew he was watching for something specific. The thermal anomaly at the chamber location was growing. In 2012, 2 years before Garrett's dive, the water temperature at the exact position of cargo hold section CD had registered 2 degrees Fahrenheit above the surrounding ocean. In 2018, the anomaly had increased to 8 degrees. The data from March 2024, just 1 month before Garrett's expedition, showed a 23-degree differential. The progression was exponential, accelerating, as if something inside that sealed chamber was becoming more active, generating more energy, preparing for something. Naval activity around the site confirmed that the government was aware of this development. Ship tracking data available through maritime monitoring websites showed that the USNS Bowditch, officially classified as an oceanographic survey vessel, had spent 19 consecutive days stationed directly over the Titanic coordinates in August of 2023. The vessel had launched ROV operations 37 times during that period, more intensive investigation than any previous expedition to the wreck. Yet no scientific papers had been published, no findings had been announced, no explanation had been offered for why a military vessel needed to spend nearly 3 weeks examining a civilian shipwreck that had already been thoroughly documented. Garrett tried to move on with his life, tried to focus on teaching and raising Maya, tried to accept that some mysteries were beyond his ability to solve. But in October of 2024, 6 months after his dive, he received an email at 3:17 in the morning. The sender address was a random string of numbers and letters. The message contained no text, just 2 attachments. The first was a sonar image dated October 9, 2024, showing the interior of the forbidden chamber in resolution sharp enough to count individual hieroglyphic symbols on the walls. The image showed 4 sarcophagi, not 3. 4. The fourth was smaller than the others, different in shape, positioned in the center of the room approximately 15 feet from the nearest wall, in a space that had been completely empty when Garrett's ROV had explored the chamber 6 months earlier. The second attachment was a photograph of a papyrus fragment, ancient and deteriorating, with a typed translation beneath the hieratic script. The translation read, "When the 3 awaken the 4th, the seal of darkness shall be broken. What Akhenaten buried beneath the waves shall return to the land of the living. The sun disk opens. The eternal night begins. None shall stop what comes forth." Garrett stared at the image of that 4th sarcophagus, at the impossibility of its presence, and felt his body temperature drop another degree, as if in response to simply seeing the photograph. The chamber had been sealed since 1912, buried under 12,000 feet of ocean, accessible only through the narrow gap where his ROV had entered. Nothing could have been added to that room. Nothing could have moved the existing sarcophagi or placed a new one in the center of the space. Yet the sonar image was date-stamped October 9th, authenticated with military-grade encryption signatures, showing clearly that something had changed, that the configuration of the chamber was different now than it had been in April. The thermal anomaly continues to grow. Satellite data from November of 2024 shows the temperature differential has reached 31 degrees Fahrenheit, 13 degrees higher than the reading from just 7 months earlier. Whatever is inside those sarcophagus is becoming more active, generating more heat, And if the progression continues at its current rate, the water around the chamber will reach boiling point within 3 years. The Navy has declared the entire area a restricted zone. No vessels allowed within 5 nautical miles of the coordinates, officially due to ongoing environmental assessment. But the question that keeps Garrett awake at night, the question that has no answer, is simple and terrifying. If the chamber has been sealed for 112 years at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, if nothing can enter or leave that space without detection, if the government has been monitoring it for decades, then how did a fourth sarcophagus appear in the center of that room? And what happens when whatever is inside finally wakes up?